everyone doing today? Thumbs up, smiles. Seeing some good thumbs up, seeing some hellos in the chat. I'm loving all of these happy faces. Hopefully everyone is enjoying some beautiful spring weather, maybe snowy, maybe hot, depending on where you are. I think we have a good amount of people already on our Zoom. There are a few more who are still waiting in the waiting room and connecting. So welcome to week 3. Time flies when you are learning about Arctic geopolitics. Today we have 2 incredible speakers. We will be learning about China in the Arctic and then Russia in the Arctic. And I have the privilege of introducing both my friends and colleagues at the Arctic Institute to you today. So a bit of housekeeping before I introduce Sana, our first speaker. As a reminder, if you have not yet joined a working group, please let me know which one you prefer. I'm going to be sending out those follow-up next steps and getting a email chain within each working group this evening. So I just want to make sure everyone is included in that next step, because I'll be setting up separate Zoom and scheduled for our next 2 weeks. And finally, I will be sending in my follow-up email our additional section the 1 week after that Priyank and another fellow will be presenting at. So look for that so we can get our infrastructure fill. But without further ado, I am going to hand over my virtual mic to our first speaker, Dr. Sana Kopra, who is a senior fellow at the Arctic Institute, but also a researcher at the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland, who is a prominent expert on China in the Arctic. I've shared her book link and a few recent articles. I highly encourage you to check them out. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll be asking you to come on, or I'll read them once Sana is done with her presentation. So I will hand over my virtual mic to you. You could do a brief intro. And I'm excited to learn about China in the Arctic.
Hi, everybody. Can you see my slides? Yes. So here we go. So nice to meet you all. I'm Sana Kopra. I'm a senior fellow at the Arctic Institute and also a postdoctoral researcher at the Arctic Center of the University of Lapland. So I'm based in Finland. And currently I'm studying China's Arctic policy. Previously I studied China's, well, I still do study China's climate policy, but my PhD, which I've defended in November 2016, focused on China's role in, or China's notions of responsibility in international climate politics. And my talk today is based mainly on the book that we published a year ago. It was an edited volume with Timo Koivurama, Chinese Policy and Presence in the Arctic. If you are interested in China's Arctic policy, I would highly recommend that you take a look at the book. If you don't have access to the book, I mean, the libraries are closed quite around the Arctic Circle. I can tell you that you can also find the PDF version from the research archive of the University of Lapland for free. It's called LACRI, so if you Google, you should find all the chapters there. But let's start with China's role in the Arctic. Even though China has made, China's Arctic involvement has made headlines only during the past that past decade or so. It is not totally a newcomer to the Arctic region, but it signed the Svalbard Treaty already in 1925. But of course, it didn't take part in Arctic activities at that time, but it took until the late 1980s or early 1990s when the Chinese scholars started to take part in international research activities in both polar areas, mainly in the Antarctic, but also in the Arctic region. And in 2013, China got observer status in the Arctic Council. And in 2017, the Polar Silk Road was introduced to the world. And then in 2018, China published its first ever Arctic strategy. And when it comes to international law that organize or regulates Arctic politics and Arctic governance, China is party to the all the important agreements, namely the UNCLOS, and China also took part in the development of Polar Code and the Fisheries Agreement. But China has not made any territorial claims in the Arctic, and it's not likely to do so in the future because, there's not really ground to do so. But anyway, China has taken increasingly part in Arctic activities. You probably have heard about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this kind of a huge flagship project of the President Xi Jinping. But it's not really clear what it's all about because there is no clear definition, no clear structure or organization or any kind of institutionalized structure or clear vision or any document that would tell us what is what is a Belt and Road Initiative. So it's quite vague in that sense, but it focuses on economic development and it's an expansion of China's relations abroad. And the Polar Silk Road was added to this Belt and Road Initiative in June 2017. What it means in practice, it at least that we can expect that the Chinese government supports investments to be made in this European Arctic area alongside the Polar Silk Road. But in contrast to the Belt and Road Initiative, the Polar Silk Road makes an exception because it's the only part of the Belt and Road Initiative that has been described in an official strategy of the party states. So China's Arctic policy was published in 2018, January 2018. And well, it didn't introduce any new visions or new principles as such, but it mostly combined all the arguments and all the viewpoints that the Chinese leadership had introduced in different kind of international conferences. So it wasn't a surprising in any ways, apart from the concept of near Arctic state that was the new concept that China uses to describe its status in the Arctic region. So China has this near Arctic identity that which it uses to legitimate its role in the Arctic. So according to China, China is one of the continental states that are closest to the Arctic Circle, and that therefore it has a legitimate right to take part in Arctic politics and governance. And in similar manner, China supports or promotes this kind of globalized definition of the Arctic. So instead of describing the Arctic region as a territorial region that is based on borders of sovereign states, China sees the Arctic as a global region that is shared by international community, a shared future of humankind. But that doesn't mean that China would have somehow undermined sovereign rights of the 8 Arctic states. China's Arctic strategy underlines that it does respect the rights of 8 Arctic states, but at the same time it reminds that non-Arctic states have international rights as well. But when it comes to the role of Arctic Council in Arctic governance, China's Arctic strategy doesn't pay much attention to its role, which is again not surprising because of China's globalized vision of the Arctic region, and China's role it's always going to be quite limited in the Arctic Council because it's not an Arctic state as such. But because of this observer status, China has access to the working groups of the Arctic Council and all the other activities, but it doesn't have any decision-making power. It can't vote or anything like that, but it can take part in the activities as such. But China has not taken a very active role in the Arctic Council, nor has it made any significant statements regarding the indigenous rights or some other ways collaborated with indigenous peoples. So China's relationship with the indigenous people seems to be quite well complex. So the Arctic Council doesn't offer us, I mean, if we study China's role in the Arctic, and we look at China's role in the Arctic Council, it doesn't give me much information. So what we should do is that we have to look at China's interest and also the ways in which China contributes to international practices that constitute the Arctic region and Arctic affairs. Next, let's take a look at China's Arctic interest. First, the Arctic science. As I mentioned before, China started to take part in international research cooperation in both polar areas, polar regions in the early 1990s or even late 1980s. And they bought this first research icebreaker Xuelong in 1994 from Ukraine. And since then, they have conducted research on both polar areas, again, especially in the Antarctic region. And as I mentioned, China is a party to the Svalbard Treaty, and therefore it has access to scientific and economic activities or commercial activities on Svalbard. And in 2004, they constructed their first Arctic research station on Svalbard. And in 2016, Chinese started to cooperate with Swedish by launching this remote sensing satellite North Pole ground station in the northern part of Sweden. And then 2018, in October 2018, China-Iceland Arctic Science Observatory started to operate in the northern Iceland near Akureyri. And then finally, in the autumn of 2019, the first domestically built research icebreaker, Xuelong 2, was launched in China. And Finnish company Åker played an important role in designing and helping Chinese to build this icebreaker. So in general, well, there's a huge research gap in the Arctic ecosystem when it comes to the Arctic ecosystems. So we need more scientific understanding of the Arctic, and therefore China's scientific engagements has been largely welcomed by the Arctic states because, I mean, they don't have enough resources to conduct Arctic research. So Chinese investments have been very important in that sense. For example, the research station in Iceland would have never been realized without Chinese investments. But recently, there has also been more and more questions about the motives of China's Arctic science activities. I mean, people are starting to speculate what are the motives of China, why do they invest in the Arctic science? Is it only for civilian uses, or do they also have some kind of military motivations? And recently, for example, the Swedish authorities have warned about the the satellite ground station that Chinese could use that information that they get there also for military purposes. So in the future, Chinese research activities may not be welcomed in the similar way. But of course, climate change is an important for China, and even if there are some speculations about the military aspects of the research on climate change is very important, and it's also important for the Chinese, because China is one of the countries that are very vulnerable to climate change. You know, many Chinese megacities are located in the coastal area, for example, and also food security is a huge, very important issue for the Chinese, and climate change is going to harm China's agricultural production. And there are also research findings showing that Arctic climate change is going to increase air pollution in eastern China. So, of course, the government wants to know more about these linkages. And at the same time, climate change is also a kind of soft issue. It's not very controversial issue, so it's a good issue to cooperate globally and also at the regional level. But I must say that I was very disappointed when I read China's Arctic policy, because it didn't introduce any additional measures to tackle climate change. It only calls for scientific research on Arctic climate change, and it seems to somehow celebrate the economic possibilities offered by the melting of the Arctic ice caps. And given that China is the biggest CO2 emitter in the world, I would have hoped that it would have showed its emerging climate leadership by introducing more ambitious climate change targets in its Arctic policy, but it didn't do so, and it didn't mention black carbon issues either. So there was a significant gap when it comes to climate change. And then we have natural resources. As you know, the Arctic is estimated to hold a lot of natural resources, and China is, of course, also interested in exploiting those resources. The Yamal LNG project in Russia is the most important, and basically the well, more or less the only project that has been realized so far in the Arctic region. But Pavel is going to talk about Russia in the next slot. So I'm not going to go into details this time. But China is an important investor in this project, and it's also important for China to get LNG and decrease the dependence on coal and oil also. And then Iceland's geothermal energy is of interest to China. And then mining, there are important minerals in the Arctic, and they are of interest to China. But as you know, or probably know, there were elections in Greenland just last week, and the new government it opposes the opening of these new mines which also have Chinese investors involved. And so it seems that at least in the near future, China is not going to realize its mining plans in Greenland. And then, of course, fish is of interest to China.
Soha!
Sorry?
Oh, sorry about that. I think someone was unmuted.
Okay. And then shipping. Again, we have the same map as in the first slide, or the second slide. You see the Polar Silk Road here. It's basically a new name for the Northern Sea Road that is located in northern coast of Russia. And for China, this is very much of interest because it offers a shorter road to the European markets. And also that they can use it to transport this LNG from Yamal to China, but also because of the fact that it offers an alternative maritime route. I mean, compared to the traditional routes, the Chinese regard the Polar Silk Road much more safer alternative. And by safer, they mean mainly because there are no pirates in that area, and also because there are no presence of the United States or its allies. But when it comes to environmental or humanitarian aspects, of course, it's not safer as such. But as you know, there might be some issues at the Suez Canal. So this Polar Silk Road is also a good alternative for the use of Suez Canal. But more importantly, it offers an alternative to the Malacca Strait. That it's a very narrow strait, and there are a lot of pirates, and also the US and the allies of US could block that strait if there's some kind of conflict in the future or some kind of geopolitical tensions. And China is currently very dependent on energy imports that come through this Malacca Strait. So the use of Polar Silk Road and the Yamal energy would also be of interest for the security, energy security reasons. But at the moment, the infrastructure along the Polar Silk Road or the Northern Sea Road is quite undeveloped. So there has to be more massive infrastructure developments. And Russia doesn't have enough finances to build all these ports and railways and all other stuff they need. So they hope that Chinese would invest in development of the Northern Sea Road, and the Chinese have expressed their interest to do so. And the Yamal LNG project is the first or probably the only concrete step to build the Polar Silk Road, because all the other plans, well, there are not many other plans or none other plans that would somehow made the Polar Silk Road more concrete in practice. I mean, China has proposed to buy or construct airports in other parts of the Arctic, namely the Greenland and Finland. But both these proposals were blocked for security reasons. And also, as I mentioned, the mining projects are now seems to be on hold, and also the speculations about dual use of Chinese research stations have made it more difficult to establish more new research stations in the region. But the Chinese are also take part in this Arctic Connect project that would construct a new data cable that would provide us faster internet between the Europe and Asia. And then we have the Arctic Corridor project, which also has faced significant difficulties during the past year or so. I mean, from the Chinese perspective, this Arctic Corridor project is only one project that would connect the Polar Silk Road to the European markets or to Central Europe through this new railway and new tunnel. But at the regional level in Finland, we see this, we consider this as two different projects. There is an Arctic Railway, and then there is a Helsinki tunnel project. But the Chinese plan is that, and the investors in general plan that there would be built a new deep water port in Kirkenes. So then they could take train and use the new Arctic Railway to Rovaniemi, and then utilize the existing railways to Helsinki, and then the train would go under the Baltic Sea to Tallinn via the new water tunnel. But both these projects has been contested, very much debated at the national level in both countries. Especially the Arctic Railway has been contested not only because of the economic feasibility has been questioned, but especially because it would go straight through the Sami lands and it would have very negative impact on the culture and traditions of the Sami, and also the pristine nature in that area, especially in the Inari area. And then also the Helsinki Tunnel has been rejected by Estonia last summer, I think. They informed that they will not accept Chinese investments in such a critical infrastructure. And but now there seems to be some kind of new plan to build this tunnel, but it wouldn't include Chinese investors, but more some kind of European funds. But anyway, it seems that neither of these projects will be realized in near future. And one of the reasons why is also that Finland is going to publish a new Arctic strategy later this month or maybe next month. And the new strategy won't mention the Arctic Railway anymore. So Finland is planning to utilize the existing railways to Haparanda and then the port of Narvik. And that's also the option that the EU would prefer. And then we have tourism. As you probably have noticed, the Chinese middle class people have more money and more time to travel, and many people have been to the US and to Europe and elsewhere, but not everyone has been to the Antarctic and or the Arctic. So that's a way how you can get some more status in social media, for example. So that's one of the reasons why people want to go to the Arctic. And in Euro-Arctic, the number of Chinese travelers has grown very rapidly. I mean, before the pandemic, of course. Now there are no tourists in the Arctic at the moment. And of course, the local people have mostly welcomed the growing number of tourists because it brings them economic benefits, more jobs and other taxes and other revenues. But at the same time, there are also some new challenges for the local people because for the infrastructure and the environment, but also for the local communities. And in the future, there is a risk that the number of Chinese tourist companies will increase, and then they would not benefit the local companies anymore, but Chinese would utilize the services of the domestic operators, and then the economic benefits would go to China and wouldn't benefit the local people in a similar way. But that's not haven't happened in Finland or Russia or in Norway and Sweden, but in Russia, Murmansk, there has been this kind of development, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have diplomacy. As you probably know, Liu Xiaobo got a Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, and the Chinese cut the diplomatic relationship between Norway because they didn't like the fact. And then they finally normalized their relations in 2016. And Finland has had this very special relationship with China. Xi Jinping visited Finland 2017, and we also got some pandas in Ähtärit Zoo. But with other Arctic states, China's relations remain quite complicated. With Russia, of course, they have very important economic plans and investment cooperation, but the relationship is still quite complicated because of the historic untrust and other reasons. I mean, Russia doesn't want to see China having too much influence in the Arctic either. So there's it should find some kind of balance how to benefit from Chinese investments, but not to increase China's political influence, or not to mention military influence in the Arctic. But science diplomacy is very important for China's Arctic involvement. China Nordic Arctic Research Center was established in 2013, and China-Russia Arctic Research Center was established in 2019. And China has also actively taken part in different kind of informal gatherings, informal Arctic conferences, especially these huge annual Arctic conferences, such as the Arctic Frontiers in Tromsø and the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik. And China also had its first Arctic Circle China Forum in May 2019. It was in Shanghai. And what is also interesting is that China, together with Japan and South Korea, they established this trilateral high-level dialogue on the Arctic in 2015, and it's quite interesting that the Arctic states are invited as observers of this platform, but the platform hasn't got any political influence for the time being, and it's probably not going to be a very important Arctic forum in the future either. Then some words about risks and concerns that China's growing role in the Arctic has caused among the Arctic states and peoples. I already mentioned the potential dual use of Chinese facilities, both Chinese infrastructure facilities and Chinese scientific facilities. So if China takes part in building ports or other infrastructure, could it also be used for military purposes? And the scientific knowledge, what purposes it's used. And when it comes to the economic investments, there are also some risks related to those. Of course, they are very much welcomed by the local actors often because they bring some new jobs, new business opportunities, but there are also risks that small Arctic economies or municipalities become very dependent on Chinese investments, and then there is a risk that they become too dependent on Chinese investments and start to pay a lot of attention to Chinese interests when making decisions, even to a level that would be seen as some kind of new Finlandization. And also that China could use economic investments as some kind of political tools if there are disagreements. And then the environmental and social performance of Chinese actors has also caused concerns among the people, especially, of course, the NGOs, environmental NGOs, because of the low track record of China in Africa. But there are no evidence that China wouldn't respect regional or local norms in the Arctic. So it seems that China wants to follow all the laws. So that's not really, in that sense, not a big issue. But there are also some people at the local level who are also scared that the Chinese investments are not realized at all, because there are many plans, but not many project has been realized. And of course, they are worried whether or not they will ever be realized. So let's conclude. It seems that China seems to introduce some kind of discursive shift from traditional territorial definition of the Arctic towards more global understanding of the region. And at the moment, China's power in the Arctic is mainly based on economic power. And of course, scientific activities are very important. And there is no evidence that China's military presence would have somehow increased in the Arctic. But there has not been open discussion about the potential development of China's military presence either. But anyway, China is not likely to make any territorial claims in the Arctic in the future. But as you know, there's a lot of talk about the intensifying great power rivalry in the Arctic. And that's, of course, important. But I want to emphasize in this final slide that even if there are intensifying great power competition or geopolitical tensions in the Arctic, climate change is still there. It hasn't disappeared anywhere. And if we focus only on military security discussions and things like that, there's a risk that we forget or dismiss the environmental agenda. Climate change is still the most important security threat in the Arctic, and because China is the biggest CO2 emitter in the world, it's very important that it takes part in all the forums where climate change is being mitigated, and the Arctic is, of course, one of those arenas. And it's also important that China would assess its Arctic ecological footprint. It hasn't done it so far. So it would be important to know what kind of pollution and other environmental harms China directly or indirectly causes in the region. And when it comes to China and the Arctic states, it would be very important to increase cooperation, climate cooperation, especially when it comes to the reduction of black carbon emissions. As I mentioned earlier, there's lack of scientific knowledge on black carbon emissions and the connections between air quality and public health and climate policies in China, and international cooperation, international science cooperation would help to solve these knowledge gaps or fulfill these knowledge gaps. So it's important to have China on board in that sense. And it wasn't actually my final slide, but this is the final slide. We had at the Arctic Institute, we had a China series last spring, if I remember correctly. We had a good number of articles and commentaries on different kind of China's role on the Arctic, different kind of perspectives, and I highly recommend that you take a look at these pieces. You find them all online, and if you want, you can also download all the text as a PDF version report. So please take a look if you are interested in China.
Thank you so much. And if everyone could please join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you, Sanna, for such a comprehensive presentation that covered so much. And also, as a climate researcher, I appreciated your last points, particularly around climate change being a catastrophic threat, China's role in emissions, and black carbon research. We already have a lot of questions. So I will kick us off by asking Samuel if you would like to come on and ask your question first.
Yeah. Thank you for a really awesome talk. I was just wondering, considering China's emphasis on Arctic shipping and the Polar Silk Road overlaps with it, does China have a firm public position on the dispute between the US, UK, Canada, etc., with Russia over Russia's ownership and claims to regulate shipping on the Northern Sea routes, given its complicated relationship?
Well, as far as I know, they haven't expressed any opinions on that matter, because China doesn't interfere other states, internal issues. So it would be quite surprising if it would have a strong opinion in these kind of matters.
Thank you. And I think this will also be a good follow-up next week. A lot of the questions and topics that Sanna presented will be continuing the conversation with our focus on Greenland and on shipping specifically next Tuesday. So there will be lots of opportunities to follow up. Marco, do you want to come on and ask your question next?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. My question is about the election in Greenland, since you mentioned that the party that has been elected will probably stop the mining in the south of the island. What will be the impact, according to your opinion, to the China's energy strategy in the Arctic? I mean, it will be a big change of plan for China or no? Thank you.
Well, what can I say? Of course, it makes China's role more difficult in the Arctic, but I don't know what would be the other options. I mean, of course, Russia is of course important for China, so it's of course possible that they will increase their cooperation with Russia, but otherwise, I don't know if there would be any kind of plan B in this sense. It's difficult to say. I don't dare to make any speculations.
And maybe Pavel will have a comment from the Russia side in our second hour. KK, would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Very nice to meet you, Sana, in person. I read your 2019 China and the Arctic and the opportunities and challenges for Chinese-Finnish Arctic cooperation. And if I recall correctly, tourism and infrastructure and shipbuilding are the cooperatives, the Finnish cooperatives, Chinese-Finnish cooperatives. And I'm just wondering, since 2019, is the reception the same for the Finnish population and Finnish government, or has that sort of shifted or changed at all since 2019?
Do you mean when it comes to tourism or in general?
Just the reception as far as the cooperation between the two countries.
Yeah, well, like in all, I suppose in all the Nordic countries, the relationship with China is becoming more and more, well, I wouldn't say challenging, but there's at least growing criticism against China, more speculation. I mean, in the beginning, the Finnish, especially Finnish business people and also officials were very much in favor of Chinese investments, but now it seems that Helsinki is becoming more and more critical. Especially that we in the beginning of last month, we heard that the Chinese had attempt to buy or lease this airport in northern Finland, and it was quite a shocking news for many people, like not only Arctic researchers, but the general public opinion has changed a lot, and also that China has. Some politicians have had very close relationship with some Chinese officials, and it has also caused a lot of speculation in public media. So the atmosphere has definitely changed during the past couple of years, maybe.
Thank you. That's very good.
Thank you. We have another question from Ed, who I'm going to ask to come on and ask.
Hi, Sana. Simple question, at least it appears to me. China, to me, appears that they want to play a role in Arctic governance. What's going to keep China from not exhibiting its predatory behavior that it shows in other regions of the world, to include its own region with its neighbors? Like, it's always had clashes with Vietnam and the Philippines. What's going to keep China in check in the Arctic, specifically because there's really no formal military alliance in the Arctic, not including, keeping NATO out of it.
Well, in the future, China's military presence in the Arctic will probably increase. I mean, it would be naive to expect that they won't use this new scientific information for the use of submarines or things like that. But in general, we shouldn't make conclusions that if China does something in the South China Sea, it would behave in a similar manner in the Arctic, because South China Sea is a region. It's a core interest of China, and it's a regional issue. But China is not an Arctic state, so it does not have that kind of sovereign issues related to the Arctic. So it's totally two different things to talk about Taiwan and other parts of the South China Sea and these kind of things than the Arctic. But of course, China's military presence will grow everywhere in the world.
Yeah, and I'm sure we will have some additional conversation in our second hour about military in the north from Pavel as well. For now, I think we have one more question. Sigrid, would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Yes. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. So I have a few questions that are related. So you mentioned that climate change is a relatively uncontroversial topic when it comes to international cooperation. And I was wondering if you could please expand on what you mean by this. Is it really uncontroversial? And also because China's approaches to climate change have been ambiguous in some ways. For example, they are celebrating the possibilities of climate change and the melting ice with the Polar Silk Road, and simultaneously they are worrying about air pollution and the difficulties with agriculture. So I was wondering, in general, which role should we expect China to play in Arctic climate change cooperation, if any at all? And also, will it be possible for China to cooperate on mitigating climate change without the investments in the region and the strings attached? And also, will it be in China's interest to even cooperate on mitigating climate change, since it has so many economic possibilities for them? Thank you so much. That was maybe a lot of questions, but yeah, thank you.
Well, as you have probably heard, China has promised to cut halt the emission growth by the end of by the 2030s, and also that they strive for the climate carbon neutrality by 2060. So in that sense, it was a very promising news that they are really considering this carbon neutrality already now. But of course, 2016 is very far. But anyways, and before the presidency of Donald Trump, China and the United States cooperated on climate change. And the cooperation between China and the United States was very important in order to make the Paris Agreement. And I hope that the new presidency of the United States would find the way how to, re-establish this cooperation with the Chinese. But of course, the trade war and economic competition makes it very difficult to, find the ways how to cooperate. For example, in climate technologies or these kind of things. But in general, I think we should expect that China takes climate change very seriously. I mean, if it wants to be a legitimate stakeholder in the Arctic, it should take part in climate change mitigation in the region. Of course, it's an external actor to the region, so its climate policy focuses mostly on global level, not really the regional level. But anyway, China's climate policy is one of the most important factors determining the future of the Arctic. So we should demand it to shoulder its responsibility. But at the same time, Chinese, of course, watch what the others do. And if we in the Western countries don't shoulder our climate responsibility, why would they do? I mean, we have already outsourced so huge proportion of our CO2 emissions to China and other countries, developing countries, by, our factories have moved to China, and so all the emissions are produced in China, but then we buy these products and so on. So most of, for example, my emissions are emitted in China, and if we don't consider these issues at the international level, international climate politics, then it's going to be, well, not fair for the Chinese. I mean, we should remember that consumption causes the most of the carbon emissions. So this is one of the key issues when it comes to China's climate policy.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes before our second fantastic speaker. So I'm going to ask Suprita if you would like to ask the final question to Sanna before we transition from China to Russia. You're on mute.
Good evening, Sanna, and it was quite illuminating, whatever presentation you have made. Mine have three questions. First, how the Chinese influence is going to cause more fear for Canada, who is still prepared that Northwest Passage will not be open on the grounds of geographical feasibility, and it doesn't. It is a group of many channels, so it is not a direct route, only one route. Another, Canada is going to claim that this is historical water. These waters are historical on the basis that Inuit have occupancy since times immemorial. So in international relation, power influence is everywhere. If a powerful nation can make, if enters everywhere, the chapter of geopolitics actually begins there. So how this emergence of China and decline of Russia, both this situation is going to give a setback, or it is going to an opportunity for a country like Canada, because initially Canada and Russia were favoring each other's reservation that Northwest Passage and Northeast Passage is their internal waters actually. So how Chinese influence is going to influence the Canada's apprehension, or it is going to improve the Chinese Sino-Canadian relationship?
Sorry, I don't know much about the relationship between Canada and China, so I really can't answer to the questions. China has so far focused on the Polar Silk Road, which is the Northern Sea Road near Russia. And they have also mentioned that, or portrayed a picture of the use of the Trans-Polar Route in the future. So they are also preparing themselves to use the the shortest route through the North Pole, and that would also be of interest to China, because then they wouldn't have to use internal waters of Russia. So I would expect that the Trans-Polar Route is the next big thing, but I don't know about the Northwestern Passage, sorry.
Thank you for answering Oh, Suprita, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I just wanted to know that how the Chinese entrance is very powerful entrance and influential policy is going to encourage other newcomers like Brazil, who has been the member. So maybe Brazil is now also having is introducing its Arctic policy, and other Southeast Asian nations, Japan and Korea. So how it is going to make a new political dynamics in the Arctic in case of new entrants actually.
Well, I must say that I don't know much about Brazilian Arctic policy either, but in general, we can.
Through BRICS, they are trying to enter. That BRICS has about.
Okay, yeah. Well, in general, of course, China wants to see the Arctic region as a global Arctic, not a territorial region based on sovereign states. So in that sense, it's cooperation with any BRICS countries, apart from, of course, Russia, and other South Asian or Asian countries. It's supports that view. I mean, if there are more and more non-Arctic states active in the Arctic, then the Arctic Council have to somehow probably react, and the Arctic states have to react. So in that sense.
May I have a last question?
Sorry?
May I have a last question? Probably this you will answer. Because China is investing so much in making infrastructure in the Arctic region. So do you think it is good for the Arctic environment? Probably Arctic environment will get a setback due to this type of construction of heavy infrastructure.
Environment?
Yeah. They are going to make heavy infrastructure like developing new ports and new airports. So definitely these will increase the entrance of new people, and so environmental will be questioned. The environmental costs are there. So will this Chinese more investment is going to cause more damage for the Arctic environment?
Well, the Chinese seems to follow the local regulations in the Arctic, but if the local regulations, local environmental standards are not ambitious, then it won't probably push forward stricter standards. So I think, for example, well, basically Russia is playing the gatekeeper role here. If Russia wants and forces China to follow strict, ambitious environmental standards, and required its partners to follow strict environmental standards, then China will do so. But if they don't require that, then why would China do so? So it's up to the Arctic states themselves what kind of regulations they put forward. And also, of course, the EU is playing a very important role in that sense. If we buy energy from Russia and we don't care what kind of practices Russia has, it's also our fault that why don't we require the, Russians to, pay more attention to environmental aspects and stop gas flaring and these kind of things.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And again, if everyone could join me, please, in giving a huge, huge round of applause. Thank you, Sanna, for being so generous with all of your expertise, with answering our questions, and giving us, I think, a lot to think about over the course of the next 7 days, especially as we talk about shipping in Greenland next week. And I'm sure there will be some connections to Pavel's presentation next. So thank you so, so much, Sanna.
Thank you very much for the invitation and very, very interesting questions, very tricky ones. Thank you.
A testament to how fantastic all of our fellows are, that they ask hard-hitting questions. We are now going to move to our second hour and our second incredible speaker. I'm going to ask Pavel Devyakin to come on screen now. He is also a good friend and a longtime colleague at the Arctic Institute. He is on our leadership team, and he's also a research fellow at the Stanford US-Russia Forum. He has published, similarly to Sana, plenty on Russia, a few of which I have shared. And today he's going to give an overview and some of his insights into Russia in the Arctic. So I will hand it over to you, Pavel.
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Sana, on a wonderful presentation. I hope I can follow up with something as excellent. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to quickly run through, this is my outline for the presentation. I'm going to quickly run through some Russian Arctic history, some important chapters, and talk about the economic interests. There's a lot to Russian Arctic policy and foreign relations in the Arctic. I think I'll try to do a really big overview, but it's important to start with Russia's Arctic history because it helps us understand how Russia should be seen as an Arctic nation, how Russians see the Arctic, and what factors go into developing Russia's important Arctic interests. So people have lived in the Russian Arctic since the end of the last ice age, so 12,000 years ago. Of course, they were the indigenous people, which include the Nenets, the Evenk, the Chukchi, and the Sami as well. And the first Slavic or Russian settlers of the Arctic were the Pomors. Pomor means by the sea in Russian, and they were mostly fishermen, hunters, trappers, merchants who were interested in engaging with the indigenous people for the fur trade. They migrated from Novgorod in the 11th century and settled around the White Sea, which is present-day Arkhangelsk. And then they may have even sailed to Spitsbergen, also known as Svalbard. The Pomors left Novgorod for economic interests, but also there's a lot of anthropological research on them that they were part of what's called the Old Believers, which were different from other Christians in Russia, in that they rejected marriage and rejected praying to the Tsar. So if you go to the Russian north, the icons in churches, they're different from icons that you find in other parts of Russia. They pray to 3D icons rather than 2D icons. And then as a fun side note, there's some thoughts in my family that this is where my last name comes from. My last name, Devyatkin. Devyat means 9 in Russian, and it's believed in my family that that our ancestors were these old believers who followed a 9-day week. So instead of the Sabbath or the day of prayer on the 7th day, they followed on the 9th day. So that's the Pomors, the first Russian people in the Arctic. And so the 16th and 17th centuries were very important for Russia's expansion into the Arctic. Ivan IV, who was the first Russian ruler to call himself Tsar, which comes from the word Caesar, expanded into Siberia and Tatarstan. And those expeditions, after capturing the capitals of Kazan and Astrakhan, they reunified Russian lands and pushed the Russian Empire to the northern coast. And so I mentioned the Pomors and Ivan the Terrible's reign, because even from the early centuries, the North was seen as like a place of exile. And I'll come back to that when I discuss the Soviet Union as well. So in the 18th century, the Great Northern Expeditions of Peter the Great were also really important for the expansion of the Russian Empire. Peter the Great inspired by the great European maritime discoveries, financed many expeditions to Kamchatka, and even financed the Danish captain Vitus Bering, after which the Bering Strait, which is between Alaska and Russia, is named after. You can see this is an old map from the Great Northern Expeditions that the North American Arctic is not so well understood, but it was during this expedition that a detailed cartographic assessment of Russia's northern coast was produced. And so the main aim of these expeditions was to open up a northern sea route. But during this time, Petersburg, not Moscow, Petersburg was more interested in expanding into Central Europe, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. So it wasn't the prime focus of the Tsars. And here's one of the really interesting expeditions in the 18th century. Mikhail Lomonosov, who was Pomor himself, is a famous Russian polymath, scientist, writer. He's often regarded as Russia's Benjamin Franklin. Lomonosov participated in the Great Northern Expeditions for 20 years, and he explained, from his research, he explained the role of the sun as a source of heat in the Arctic, and believed that heat exchange from the sea to the air through the ice cover moderated the Arctic climate. And also this gave the first scientifically based theory of aurora borealis. And in this map, you could see Lomonosov portrayed the ocean going around the North Pole, which is contrary to generally accepted opinion back then. Lomonosov was on these expeditions with Vasily Chichagov, who led an expedition to navigate across the Arctic Ocean to the Bering Strait from Spitsbergen, as it was named, trying to find the Northeast Passage. And it was in the 1760s when the Alaskan coast of North America was first visited by Russian explorers. It wasn't until the 1780s that the first Russian settlements in the American continent were founded. And then it was in 1867 when Russia sold Alaska to the United States. So now we're going to move to the end of the Russian Empire. It's interesting that the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, which Russia lost to Japan, it had to do with had a lot to do with Russia's lack of icebreakers. Top military leaders in the Russian Navy and even the famous Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev tried to convince the Tsar about how important icebreakers were for navigating the Arctic during the summer, but they failed to encourage the Tsar to invest in icebreakers. And so the consequence was a lack of support for the Russian Empire's Pacific forces during the Russo-Japanese War. Without an icebreaker fleet, the Russian Navy was which was stationed in the Baltics. It was forced to go around the whole world to defend the Pacific shores. And so Russia lost the war with Japan, and the war is seen as a precursor to the 1905 Russian Revolution and eventually the October Revolution in 1917, which brought down the Russian Empire. And then Russia broke out in civil war. The Arctic is the setting for an invasion by Western troops. Here are photographs of American soldiers on the left and British soldiers who intervened in the Russian Civil War by occupying Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. They arrived in 1918, the day after the Bolshevik government signed the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And so there was an intervention of thousands of US troops and UK troops and other allied troops. The US expedition was called the Polar Bear Expedition, and the last allied troops left in 1919. And now I'm going to move to the early to the Soviet Union. And in the 30s, the Arctic played an important role for the Soviet Union's industrialization. It was also the setting for the brutal Gulag camps under Stalin. And also Stalin created this concept of the Red Arctic, of lifting the Arctic in the Soviet Union's patriotism and pop culture. It was in the 30s that coal was extracted from Vorkuta. Precious metals were extracted from the Kola Peninsula. Oil and gas was produced in Ukhta. And it was in the 40s when Moscow started prioritizing Norilsk for precious metals. So obviously the Arctic was very important for the USSR's industrialization. And it was during this period as well that there was the first attempt at a centralized administration of the Northern Sea route, which has been described as one of the Soviet Union's greatest experiments in hyper-centralization. The Glav-Sevmorput, as it was called, was a state within a state, controlling a territory of 2 million square kilometers and employing as many as 100,000 people. And the Glav-Sevmorput was responsible for Arctic research, shipping, mineral production, and aviation as well, agriculture, managing the population relations with indigenous people. But the experiment Glav-Sevmorput did not last long. It was dismantled in 1938. Also in this period, in 1932, there was the International Polar Year, which 44 countries participated in, which was an international science cooperation project. And it was also the period when these famed expeditions happened. And you can see on the left, the Soviet explorer Otto Schmidt, who I think has one of the greatest beards in the Arctic expedition game. He sent the first vessel to cross the Northern Sea route in a single summer. Otto Schmidt was a hero. He won many awards, such as Hero of the Soviet Union, and was put in charge of all of the major Arctic exploration projects. It was also in 1937 that Soviet planes set the world record for long-distance aviation by crossing the North Pole from Moscow to the United States. And the Soviet Union became the first nation to land an aircraft at the North Pole and establish a scientific outpost there. So that's all to say that that since the earliest years, it's been really important for Russia for patriotism, for the imagery as a great power, and culture in general. During World War II, the Nazis tried to invade the Soviet Arctic, but failed to stop the Allied Arctic convoys. So thousands of brave American, British, and Canadian sailors navigated the harsh Arctic conditions to transport tanks, fighter planes, fuel, ammunition, food to the Soviet Union to support the war effort. There's a propaganda poster on the right about that. On the left is Operation Silver Fox, which is the name for the Nazi invasion, which ultimately failed because they never were able to occupy Murmansk, which was the hub for the Allied Arctic convoys. It's still debated, though, whether the Arctic convoys were super important for the Soviet Union's ability to succeed in World War II, but it showed the Allies' commitment to helping the Soviet Union before the Western Front was opened. And here's just a photo, which I thought was cool. Some photos of Soviet soldiers feeding polar bears. And they all say that if you see a bear cub, that you're already dead because the polar bear's mom is going to be nearby. So that guy in in the bottom right. It's pretty amazing that he's able to get so close to polar bear cub. So here I'm going to talk about the Cold War. And during the Cold War, the Arctic was both a time of deadly confrontation, but also of peaceful exploration and scientific research. It was during the Cold War that the U.S. set up its distant early warning system across North America, which was matched by the USSR's missile attack warning system. The Arctic was, of course, important during the Cold War, as it was the shortest distance between the superpowers. And after the 1960s, when submarine-launched ballistic missiles were developed, the Arctic was very important for confrontation between the US and the USSR. This is when the cat and mouse games underneath the Arctic ice happened between the submarines. But it was also in the Cold War when the International Geophysical Year happened. This was in 1957 to 1958. And this was inspired by the International Polar Year. It was an international science cooperation project as well. And it wasn't until Stalin died in 1953 that the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union agreed to join this program, opening the door to several significant collaborations with the US and other participating countries such as Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Sweden. 67 countries in total were part of the International Geophysical Year. It wasn't only concentrated on the Arctic, but in the Arctic, there were 40 IGY research stations installed to study weather at high latitudes and the movements of sea ice, and important discoveries were made regarding radio interference induced by aurora borealis. And it was in 1987 when the last leader of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, gave his famous speech in Murmansk, where he called for the Arctic to become a zone of peace. And he envisioned the Arctic free of nuclear weapons, with restraints on naval activity, and promoted the peaceful use of natural resources and endorsed international cooperation, especially in the area of environmental protection. After the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the Russian military and geological exploration was largely absent from the Arctic. It was in this period when Russia entered the crazy 90s, as they call it, the era of shock therapy. There was the 1998 financial crisis. The Russian armed forces faced many problems. For example, the Chechen War under Yeltsin. And it was in this period when oligarchs such as today's richest man in Russia, Vladimir Potanin, infamously gained their wealth through the loans for shares program, which is regarded as a scandal. And so Potanin acquired the company Nornickel. And you might remember Potanin was also, and his company was responsible for the oil spill disaster, which happened in Russia recently, and was the biggest oil spill in the Arctic. But one piece of good news was that the Arctic Council, the intergovernmental forum that acts on consensus between the 8 Arctic states, representatives of indigenous people and NGOs, was founded in 1996. So that's a little history, and now I'm going to move to the current day and start by talking about economic interests. Russia has important socioeconomic interests in the Arctic, and they're related to the dramatic changes going on in the region. The Arctic is warming at a rate of nearly 3 times faster than the rest of the world, and is predicted to be completely ice-free by 2050. The climate crisis is induced in rhetoric, and so it's expected that that there will be greater access to the huge natural gas and oil reserves in the region, as well as transforming the Arctic Ocean into a navigable ocean with international shipping lanes. So approximately 2/3 of all of Russia's oil and gas is estimated to be found in Russia's Arctic exclusive economic zone and undisputed territories. And up to 20% of Russia's GDP and 10% of exports are produced in the Arctic territories. And so with Russia's economy so dependent on the extraction, production, and export of hydrocarbons, Russia evidently sees the region as vital for its economic development and future. And one example is what was mentioned by Sana earlier, is the Yamal LNG project, which is 30% owned by China through the CNPC and Silk Road Fund. And there are other cooperative projects like that, or investments from other countries, like from Saudi Arabia through Aramco, and France's Total is also involved in different LNG projects in the Arctic. And that's a map on the left-hand side of the epicenter of Russia's Arctic oil and gas activity, the Yamal and Gdansky peninsulas. There was also prospect for cooperation with the US and Western countries. For example, there was going to be the largest oil deal in history between ExxonMobil and Rosneft, but the deal fell through in 2014 because of sanctions related to the Ukraine crisis. Sanctions and counter-sanctions from Russia. Next, I'll talk about the Northern Sea route. And so the development of the Northern Sea route has been a top priority for Russia for decades. In 2018, Putin announced that there would be a goal of increasing freight shipping along the NSR to 80 million tons by 2024. And I think it was 30 million tons achieved at the, 31 million tons was achieved at the end of 2019. The NSR is regarded as important for the international economy, as it's estimated to be 36% shorter than the traditional Suez Canal route. But that's not to say that it doesn't have its own risks regarding sea ice and super waves. So there's still environmental risks and a lack of infrastructure, and still debates on the nature of regulation and control over the shipping route, how that will affect the international economies. But there are protests from many companies against the protectionism that the Russian government is imposing, arguing that, like for example, Novatek argues that the protectionism is delaying the really important resource extraction. There have been exemptions to the different regulations. For example, one of the regulations was that ships sailing in the NSR are obliged to sail under a Russian flag, as well as there's a requirement to only use Russian-built ships. So these kind of regulations contribute to the debate of whether or not the NSR is going to become a truly international shipping lane. And then also the CNPC and CNOOC from China. That's the China National Petroleum and Offshore Oil Corporations have minority stakes in projects in the Arctic, and so the NSR is used to ship natural resources extracted from those areas to East Asia and China. And there's the question of whether winter transit is possible. 3 ice-capable LNG carriers traveled the length of the route without icebreaker escort for the first time during the middle of winter recently. So as climate change intensifies, it's the question of whether or not the NSR will be viable, especially compared to the Suez Canal, continues to be discussed. And lastly, I'll mention also just that there's also the possibility that hydrogen will emerge as an alternative energy source to be produced around Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula. Russia's former energy minister, Alexander Novak, he said that hydrogen may make up between 7 to 25% of the global energy balance by 2050, as soon as the issues of high production costs and challenges of transportation are resolved. So those are the economic interests of Russia, and here is how Russian policymakers regard the Arctic and create Russia's official Arctic policy. So Russia's official Arctic strategy and interests are best understood by examining the government publications that are put forward by the different bodies of the Russian state. You can see the different government agencies involved in decision-making on the left. This is a chart from Sergunin and Konishev. And so the official Arctic policy of the Russian Federation, you could start by looking at the 2008 document that's called Foundations of the State Policy of the Russian Federation in the Arctic for the period until 2020 and beyond. It was adopted by then President Dmitry Medvedev, and the document puts forward Russia's interests, objectives, and agenda for implementing its policy in the Arctic. And this can be summarized as first, utilizing the Arctic as a strategic energy and natural resource base. Second, managing the Northern Sea route, the maritime shipping lanes to mostly transport extracted resources. And also right now, shipping along the Northern Sea route is mainly cabotage shipping. So domestic, not necessarily from Russia to another country. Third, scientific research and collaborative projects. Fourth, improving the lives of Arctic residents, including indigenous people. Fifth, securing Russia's economic interests and sovereignty in the region with a comprehensive land, sea, and air military presence. And so there have been many documents since that 2008 document, which I mentioned. The newest one from last year has been updated to the period for to 2035. And it's interesting to look at the differences in the different documents. The previous documents also mentioned the improvement of the well-being of indigenous people, but in the document to 2035, that aim has been lifted to the level of national interest. And there, yeah, I just want to mention also the State Commission on the Arctic Development, which is headed by Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Trutnev, is the federal agency for which collects all the ministers and the governors, the regional leaders, to discuss and implement Russia's Arctic policy. At the bottom of the chart, you can see that the Coast Guard is part of the Border Guard Service, which is part of the Federal Security Service, and I'll come to I'll mention why that's important later. So this is a map of the indigenous people of the North, Siberia, and Far East in Russia, according to language groups. Russia stretches over 53% of the Arctic Ocean coastline, and approximately 2.5 million people live in the Russian Arctic, accounting for about half of the population of the whole Arctic region. Nearly all areas in the Arctic suffer from population decrease, especially people moving to Moscow or St. Petersburg for work or study and not coming back. And so the Russian government has set this priority for improving well-being, healthcare, housing, to address this population problem. And so there's been a plan to create 180,000 jobs in the Arctic over the next 15 years. So Russia has 40 recognized groups of indigenous people, and 11 of those live around or above the Arctic Circle. The largest of these are, you can see the color coding on the map, Dolgan, Nenets, Sami, Khanty, Chukchi, Evenk. And traditionally, the indigenous people of Russia rely on reindeer herding, fishing and hunting. It's interesting that the indigenous people of Russia, the indigenous groups in Russia, are called the small numbered people of Russia. And it's called that to qualify as an indigenous group, there has to be less than 50,000 people. So if the population is larger than 50,000, they're called a titular nationality. And so, for example, the Chechen people who live in Chechnya are regarded as a titular nationality. They're not in the Arctic, by the way. It's interesting also that in the Russian Arctic, women's political empowerment is seen as an example of progress towards gender equality. In contrast to women's severe underrepresentation in Russia's federal level governance, there's a strong trend towards women's political empowerment in the Arctic regions of the government of the country. Women's political participation and empowerment in decision-making processes are especially large among indigenous communities, and men are severely underrepresented in positions of power in indigenous communities of the North. So recent research from anthropologists in the Russian Arctic call it a reverse gender gap, where young indigenous men are bound by traditional and cultural expectations, whereas young women have a much wider access to career choices. But there are a lot of issues among indigenous communities in the Arctic, especially reproductive health. Most indigenous families in the Arctic unfortunately suffer from high pregnancy loss, and there's high percentages of marriage between close relatives, and high levels of child mortality. Russia's indigenous people are represented by a national organization, and Raipon is the name of the Russian Arctic Indigenous People of the North. There has been criticism from Raipon of the federal government's policies, and also criticism from the government on Raipon, accusing them of foreign aid. And so there's been tension between the Russian government and representatives of indigenous people. In 2012, the Russian Ministry of Justice even suspended Raipon's license for half a year, and forced the organization to change its structures and inside to be more in line with federal expectations, and so replaced the old leadership, which was in opposition and critical to the Russian government, with a more loyal leadership. But these issues that I mentioned, they also exist in other Arctic states, and that across the Arctic, there are legacies of colonialism, racism, and federal government's failure to support communities' social and economic well-being. COVID-19 in the Arctic has been particularly distressing for indigenous communities, disrupting local economies, and even putting the whole survival of cultures at risk, especially when elders who speak languages that are not spoken by many people, if they were to pass away, that would mean the disappearance of a whole language, a whole culture. And also indigenous people disproportionately are affected for health reasons. The Russian government's reaction to the COVID pandemic and in supporting locals and indigenous people has varied region to region, and it's mostly dependent on different regions' access to finances. But you can see from this map that when looking at the circumpolar Arctic, that the worst affected parts are found in Russia, especially in the Murmansk Oblast and the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug. That's the dark colored red on the bottom left of this map. And I've written an article about this for the Arctic Institute, which I recommend you check out. Now we're going to talk about military and security. And so I want to start by outlining Russia's Arctic security aims. Russia's military presence in the Arctic can be summarized with three main goals: to protect national sovereignty in the region, including in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf, to secure Russia's economic interests, and to demonstrate that Russia is a great power with first-rate, world-class defense capabilities. Compared to the Cold War era, Russia's military posturing in the Arctic is not focused on matching NATO. As I mentioned, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia was largely absent from the Arctic in the 90s. And so Russia's Arctic buildup and military activity is restoring and reestablishing old military assets that have been abandoned for many years. It was in 2007 when Russian strategic bombers resumed flying over the Arctic for the first time since the end of the Cold War. This can be interpreted as Russia's desire to not lose capacity. And it's more for domestic approval. So these kind of activities, especially, for example, the planting of the Russian flag on the seabed of the North Pole, these can be interpreted as for a domestic audience for people to approve rather than outward aggression or expansion. It was expected that in the wake of the Ukraine crisis that Russia would ramp up its military activities in the far north, but there wasn't a shift in the paradigm of Russia's vision of the military's role in the Arctic. Russia's military activity in the Arctic actually can be compared to those of other Arctic states that are protecting their sovereignty and economic interests, especially the US and Canada. And so nowadays, Russia's leadership realizes that most of the threats and challenges to the Arctic originate from within rather than from outside the country. And so these factors include the degradation of infrastructure, transport infrastructure, especially from the Soviet era, and moving away from the current hydrocarbon resource-oriented model of the Russian economy, and the lack of funds and skills to completely develop the Arctic zone. Now I want to mention a few interesting military exercises and activities. In August 2020, Russia carried out a part of the Ocean Shield exercise in the Bering Sea. And this was the largest military exercise at sea since the Soviet period. It even came close to Alaska, and there were headlines about how Alaskan fishermen were not aware of the exercises and were shocked to be ordered by Russian military to leave the area. The fishermen even got in touch with the US Coast Guard, who also didn't know about the exercise. In 2021, last year, there was the Umka exercise where 3 Russian nuclear submarines broke through the ice around the Franz Joseph archipelago, and in April of this month, I think it was last week, a heavily armed frigate sailed to the Norwegian Sea to quote, ensure the safety of Russian fishermen. And it's the first time that Russia's Northern Fleet was tasked to support fishing vessels in Norway's exclusive economic zone. Russia has previously expressed dissatisfaction with the Norwegian Coast Guard detaining Russian fishermen for violating fishery regulations. And so this was an example of Russia protecting its fishermen. But some experts say that it's normal for the Northern Fleet, the Russian Northern Fleet, to sail along the coast of Norway. Now I want to talk about the military activity from the West and NATO countries, because Russia's military posturing can be described as in response to that, or the other way around, that NATO and Western military activities are in response to Russia's military activities. In May and September of 2020, NATO warships from the US, UK, and Norway entered the Barents Sea just off Russia's Arctic coast for the first time since the end of the Cold War. And Russia was informed about the May exercises, but reportedly not of the September exercises. And you can imagine, because of the invasion of the US and UK troops during the Russian Civil War and the Nazi German invasion during World War II, this is a very sensitive region for Russia. Norway has also been the base for massive NATO military exercises, such as Arctic Littoral Strike in March of this year, as well as a US Air Force B-1B strategic bomber, which made history by landing in the Arctic Circle for the first time. So in general, there's this cycle of military deployments and counter deployments and buildup. It's very dangerous and deadly. And in international relations, it's called a security dilemma, where each side strives to gain the monopoly on violence in the region, but paradoxically contributes to insecurity. And so here's a chart from Heinonen, Sagunen, and Yarovoy, comparing Soviet military presence to Russian military presence, to US military presence in the Arctic during the Cold War, and current US and NATO military presence. And so you could see the numbers during the Cold War. Russia tried to match, the Soviet Union tried to match NATO's presence, but nowadays it's not, Russia's not trying to match NATO's presence. And so what's the solution to this kind of security dilemma? What's often proposed is reintroducing military to military contacts. And so that there's little rationale for Europe or NATO to escalate this security dilemma. If there was ever to be a conflict, it would have very little to do with what happens in the Arctic. It would have to do with, it'd rather be a product of tensions in other parts of the world. But the idea of this scramble for the Arctic or resource war has largely been discredited because there's an international law regime that distributes territories to each Arctic state through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And there is precedent for solving territorial disputes through diplomacy. For example, Russia and Norway resolving their decades-long arguments over the delimitation of the maritime border between Russia and Norway. Russia has also submitted data to the United Nations Commission on the limit of the continental shelf to support its claim to the Arctic seabed. And so there's lots of examples like this where dialogue and diplomacy can work to resolve military tensions. And so, yeah, I just want to mention about the military to military, the mill-to-mill contacts, that the Arctic Council is not a venue for discussing military and hard security issues. So there are calls to transform the NATO-Russia Council, or to restart the Arctic Chiefs of Defense meetings, which were put on hold after the Ukraine crisis, or to re-invite Russia into the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable. It's very important to bolster cooperation and dialogue because of the security dilemma, and there are mutual security threats related to the environment and climate change that can be solved together. And so also, actually, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum persists, and there is this week some exercises going on between the 8 Arctic Coast Guards. Yeah. Now I want to talk about international cooperation. I mentioned the Arctic Council, but so Arctic states have a long history of working together on sustainable development and environmental protection. The Arctic Council was even nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize on multiple occasions because of its successful legally binding agreements on oil spill response and search and rescue operations. And it's seen as an exemplar of cooperation in the post-Cold War era, promoting peace and stability in the region. Norway especially cooperates with Russia in the areas of fishery management, nuclear safety, search and rescue. The treaty that I mentioned in 2010 was resolved after arguments and disagreement. And so these examples show that issues in the Arctic can be solved through diplomacy and dialogue. And here is Russia's senior Arctic official at the Arctic Council, Nikolai Korchunov, who said in anticipation of Russia's chairing of the Arctic Council next month, that there are no problems that require a military solution in the Arctic, and all issues can and must be resolved at the negotiating table. And another example of cooperation, one of the most interesting ones in the 21st century, the Russian-American long-term consensus on the Arctic, or Rusalka for short, which means mermaid in Russian. And this was a project between the US and Russia, which emerged out of a memorandum of understanding between the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the Russian Academy of Sciences. And across several expeditions into the Bering and Chukchi seas between the US and Russia in the Arctic, between 2004 and 2015, Russian and American scientists worked together to produce important contributions, important discoveries related to marine chemistry, glaciology, oceanography, and understanding the ecosystem of the evolving Arctic. So that's it for now. Thank you very much. That's been an overview of Russia's interests and activities in the Arctic. There are many more aspects to Russia's Arctic affairs. I didn't mention climate change enough, or the Norilsk oil disaster, thawing permafrost, or other forms of Chinese involvement and cooperation with Russia. But I'll leave it there for now. And thank you for listening, and welcome any questions.
Thank you so much. And if everyone could please join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you, Pavel, for not just giving us a presentation on how we can think about Russia today, but putting it in a historical context, which I think is so important for asking the right questions. I'm a little biased as a geographer that I think layers of history are important, but I think your presentation proved that to be true. We have a number of questions that have come in. I am going to ask Suprita, would you like to ask your question first?
Yes, good evening, Pavel. I'm really grateful for this information which you have provided me during your presentation. I have many questions regarding, first starting from Alaska deal actually. So when Russia has made this Alaska deal, it was something far-sighted policy also, because Russia wanted to dominate its traditional enemy United Kingdom position by inviting the United States. So United States was always a favored buyer for this Alaska, according to Russian diplomats. Again, during Murmansk's speech, what Russia has planned, it was again the time of economic downturn when Alaska deal was made during an economic downturn. So now what Gorbachev has planned, that make Russia a multilateral region. He has introduced Russia, the Arctic region as a zone of peace, non-militarized, no nuclear weapons should be there. And also the Arctic mean many things, like it is the northern tip of Europe, Russia, North America, and Asia. So actually he has first time introduced that what Arctic region mean for the globe. It's not a regional thing. But now I have 2-3 questions regarding this. That is Russia again planning to be another, it appears that Russia is going to make another major change by inviting China as it has invited during the Alaskan deal. And though Russia has proposed for an inter-Arctic council, yet sometimes Russia seems that it is not very active, and especially when it comes to pollution. Russia remained a greater pollutant in case of dumping the nuclear wastage also, as well as oil spill effects also. So what Russia has, what the world can see, or non-Arctic nation students, we are saying that as Russia could have made some initiative. Okay, it has proposed for a multilateral organization, but still it is not going or it is not contributing significantly in this region. So Russia is now, this is the third time Russia is facing another economic downturn. So whether this downturn is going to invite China as a major player in Russia, because shallowest Arctic has the greatest navigational power, greatest maritime powers. 3 countries are the 3 maritime power. Canada has maritime boundary in 3. Russia itself maintains its boundary continental shelves in 3 oceans. And again, Canada is also maintaining maritime boundary in 3 nations. So is Russia appears that by maintaining the Chinese position and promoting the Chinese interest in Russian and Arctic region, it is going to invite the another major geopolitical player that it has done in during 1867 during Alaska deal?
Yeah, so I could I'll talk about Russia's invitation of China into the Arctic, and so it's not so straightforward, especially because of historical distrust, as was mentioned before. These include border issues between Russia and China, the fear of a yellow peril, and fear of foreigners, even when the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced, leading Russian experts like Sergei Karaganov were skeptical of the Belt and Road Initiative and of becoming like a little brother to China. But it was especially in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, because of the sanctions and counter sanctions, which affected the Western Russian collaborations in oil and gas projects, that Russia looked to China. And so Russia is welcoming China for collaboration in scientific research, to finance its infrastructure, oil and gas projects. And there is speculation of a military alliance between Russia and China, and perhaps in the Arctic. But this is still debated. One reason that it's not so straightforward is, I think it was last year, Russian authorities arrested the president of the Russian Arctic Academy of Sciences, like the leading Russian scientist in Arctic studies, and accused him of treason for sharing Arctic technology research with the Chinese. But on the other hand, this week, actually just this week, Chinese soldiers were invited into Russia to train in Arctic, in cold warfare capabilities. So it's not clear what's going to happen. It's still being debated. There's lots of research still going on in that. And I could discuss about Russia's attitude towards climate change as well, that you mentioned, that Russia has released a climate change adaptation plan at the beginning of 2020, after officially ratifying the Paris Agreement. Russia's climate change adaptation plan especially paid attention to the wildfires and floods that happen across Russia. Russia is aware of the issues of thawing permafrost. About 60% of Russia's territory is on permafrost. Even the Norilsk oil spill is attributed to collapsing infrastructure that fell into permafrost in Norilsk. So there is increasing awareness of climate change and environmental issues. And you bring up a very good point about the importance of nuclear safety and pollution, and that will be a welcome next step to release such a policy.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions. So I'm going to ask Samuel if you would like to come on and ask yours next.
Really great talk. Thank you. So with Russia recently submitting a continental shelf claim stretching to Canada and Greenland's EEZ, is this a move that's more economic or political? And to what extent might Russia intend to regulate foreign shipping in that area to protect its seabed resources if it's found in its favor, given its sort of protectionist stance on the NSR?
Thanks. Yeah, I don't think the claim is economic, because if you look at the estimates of resources in the Arctic, oil and gas and mineral resources are found closer to the coastlines of countries. It's hard to imagine that there are such resources in that particular place that has been signaled to the CLCS. It's perhaps more political, a sign that Russia wants to work through international law, through the UN system. The alternative would have been sending military warships there to say this is our land now, this is our seabed now. But working in the UN is welcomed. And if the UN was to rule in favor of Russia, I think just looking at the map of where that piece of seabed is, it seems very far from the Russian coastline. So any kind of protectionism regulation, it's hard to imagine. So protectionism, similar to how it's done along the Northern Sea route, closer to Russian undisputed territorial waters.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. Gabriella, would you like to ask your question next?
Yes, absolutely. I was curious to the extent you think that all of these recent reports on, ongoing militarization of the Arctic by Russia can be explained by a wish to protect Russia's vast economic interest and investment in the region, as opposed, to this great power kind of competition narrative that we're seeing.
Thank you. Yeah. Right now there's in U.S.-Russia relations, it's perhaps the worst level of U.S.-Russia relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And so there is fear of Western incursions into the Russian Arctic. But I think it's not about protecting economic interests, though. Like the recent military activity, such as the introduction of the hypersonic missiles, for example, and that it's more about standing up to NATO exercises, which are happening for the first time so close to Russia's Arctic coast. But it's definitely, right now there is a security dilemma going on in that these NATO exercises are happening in response to Russian military activity. Russia's building up military in response to NATO exercises and build up. So it's a very deadly spiral, and perhaps the question of economic interests gets lost, and that it's purely about security and strategy at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Yes. First of all, many thanks for your amazing talk. And honestly, it's the first time for me to know the historical aspects of Russian Arctic that clearly. And actually, I have two questions related to Russia and China in the Arctic. Like, first of all, I wonder how you would summarize Russians' attitude towards the development of China's Polar Silk Road in general. Also, have you ever noticed any unintended consequences of China's involvement in the energy projects in the Russian Arctic region? Thanks.
Thank you. Russia's attitudes towards the Polar Silk Road are perhaps positive and growing more and more positive, in that that the oil and gas produced in the Arctic is very much for export, and so China's interest in getting access to those resources is very welcome, and yeah, I would say it's very positive. Yeah. Unintended consequences. Wow, it's a good question. It's something that definitely needs to be researched. Yeah, it's hard to think of right now. But one thing that's been discussed is over-reliance on China, and that Russia wants to diversify its partnerships, and that so it's working with Saudi Arabia and France and other countries in financing its Arctic projects. And as China grows and even surpasses Russia in terms of GDP per capita, Russia doesn't want to be the little brother in the partnership. So perhaps political tensions could be an unintended consequence.
Something to both think about, but also perhaps write about for some briefers or future collaborations in some of our working groups. We have one final question that has come in that asks, do you think that Russia is actually interested in international cooperation in developing the Northern Sea Route, considering their security considerations with respect to the Arctic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Russia is interested in developing an international shipping route in the Northern Sea Route, but by its rules and by its regulation. And so if international shipping companies and countries interested in the Russian Arctic shipping lanes agree to using Russian ships and asking permission from the authorities to enter the region, and also follows UNCLOS and follows the established rules and norms, then such partners are welcome. Yeah, but it's still, but I think the debate on the viability of the Northern Sea Route is less concerned with regulation and more a more question of if there's adequate infrastructure and the environmental risk, and also if it's viable in contrast to the traditional Suez Canal route. And so the environmental risks, you see all these headlines about how Arctic shipping is going to take off, and after the Suez Canal debacle, that how Rosatom, the Russian agency that manages the NSR, endorsed the NSR in contrast as an alternative to the Suez Canal route. But there's still these environmental risks that the carrier ships, container ships that go through the Arctic aren't ice protected. They still need ice breakers. And so Russia is investing in and building ice breakers to support such activities. But it's a question of how fast the infrastructure, the transshipment ports, search and rescue bases and capabilities along the ports, because well, I just want to point to the world's largest shipping company, Maersk, had an accident last year in the Pacific Ocean, where hundreds of containers fell into the Pacific Ocean, and there was millions of dollars of business lost, and that was in the Pacific Ocean. So how can container shipping take off in the harsh Arctic, where sea ice is still a factor, there's still icebergs, and the unpredictable weather, and these huge waves that come out of nowhere? So it's going to be a matter of time. There are many different predictions of when the NSR could take off to be a international world-class shipping route. But Russia is definitely investing a lot of energy, a lot of money into realizing this ambition. And China's working with Russia on realizing this. China is launching satellites to monitor the Arctic weather and the shipping routes. The recent satellite that was launched by Russia, Arctica M as well, is for that purpose. So there are many, many different projects going on to achieve this Northern Sea route, but it's all a question of how long this infrastructure will take to develop.
That is the question indeed. But also, Pavel, you have made my life very easy, because this is a great segue to our first speaker next week, which is going to talk both about space and ocean governance and geopolitics. So that is a great transition to getting everyone to think about shipping and satellites and get some questions ready for next week. But for now, I want to again invite everyone in joining me for a huge, huge round of applause. Thank you, Pavel. I know you've had a busy day already. I really appreciate you being here with all of our incredible fellows and sharing your expertise and giving us, I think, a lot of points of departure for thinking about further research and discussions in our working groups. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much. And it's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for the excellent questions. And you're all welcome to shoot me an email. Looking forward to reading your briefs and your analyses of these very important